The Cabin in the Woods was the baby of Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard, though the primary force behind it was Whedon. Whedon was a longtime fan of the horror genre, but admitted to having a sense of disillusionment with the way things seemed to be drifting with horror movies, when it became more about villains chopping down a never-ending supply of dull victims, seeking to derive thrills from grotesque, torturous kills rather than through true fear. While this work would inevitably be considered as a deconstruction or parody of horror films, the origin of the film was actually, in a real sense, a love for them. Goddard launched his career when a spec script of his landed him a job working on Whedon's series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and later to the spin-off Angel. Working as a staff writer under Whedon was a terrifying learning experience for Goddard, because in television, writers are frequently producers on the show and would shape the episodes. So Whedon expected all of his staff writers to not just be in the writer's room, but to be on the set seeing things through to the end. This, however, forced Goddard to expand his understanding of how that script became a finished show, and would be an invaluable experience, even if Whedon had to practically drag Goddard down there to do it. While working on Buffy and Angel, the two frequently found themselves in situations where they would have to turn out an entire script over the course of a weekend. And while that could be disastrous, oftentimes they felt they put out some of their best work under those conditions. And as they drifted apart to work on their own projects, they often talked about maybe getting back together sometime, and perhaps doing this for a film. Just challenge themselves to put together an entire film script over one weekend. It was a fun challenge that they discussed off and on for a while, but one time at a convention, when Goddard came out with a t-shirt showing the silhouettes of a werewolf squaring off against a rearing unicorn, Whedon decided the time had now come, and proceeded to lay out for Goddard his idea. The plan was not to go in cold and do the script. That would have been pretty much dooming the project from the get-go. They knew it had to be something that couldn't be too complicated, that would be more about fully realizing the ideas rather than having to invent the story on the fly. Whedon had once had a fully realized story, beginning, middle, and end, all come together for him, and it was called Afterlife. It was the story of a government scientist who, after dying, discovers himself alive and in the body of a serial killer called Snowman. Whedon sold that script early in his career to Sony for $1.5 million, but it never got made. Fortunately, lightning struck twice, and the second fully realized story to come to Whedon was The Cabin in the Woods. Even the title had come to him as the only possible one for this. It's possible that both those incidents were drawn upon for Cabin, because the film would feature an attack by a unicorn, just like the shirt, and would feature a monster that is never shown but is referred to as Snowman. Goddard fell in love with the idea from the get-go. Whedon made clear to him that from the start, the film would begin in a break room talking about fertility. It was as far from your typical horror film as possible. But Whedon wanted to explore why rituals were repeated like this, the same archetypes in horror films. Not the same setting, because cabins are actually uncommon choices. But regardless, whether it's a parent's house, or a haunted house, or a summer camp, or outer space, the same rituals are often observed, often combined with idiocy, which was why outside manipulation was considered. Whedon's assessment of people who were stupid, not panicking and making a mistake, but clearly stupid, was frustration and anger in films. Thin the herd, he would say, when the monster was killing off the person who was literally too dumb to live. With this idea, then, Whedon built this story of the horror film's actions being by design, and the tale as much about the story of the manipulators as about the archetypal victims. The goal was to write in one weekend, but the emphasis on this challenge is on writing, not on creating. They wanted to devote that time solely to tackling making a script, so before they got anywhere close to reserving their weekend, the pair began hammering out details. What are the names of these characters? What are they like outside this world? What are the ones who are down below? What are they like? Ideas were dropped in to flesh out the concept until a rough outline was put together, then a more solid outline. Eventually, Whedon assembled a full cast list as well as wrote out the first 10 pages of the script to serve as the foundation for the actual script they would create over that weekend. With all those materials, Whedon and Goddard rented a 2-story bungalow for that weekend, checked in Thursday night, and Friday morning at 6 a.m. got up and began writing. The two sorted out who would work on what and got to work. The idea was that they wanted to easily be able to collaborate with the other if their situation required it, while at the same time not being distracted by family or co-workers. Their goal was to fully immerse themselves in this work, and this work only. When they met, it was to discuss the work of the day. When they went out to eat, they hashed out more of the story. Everything for that weekend was about cabin and nothing else. They also made sure to share the writing of both the 5 teens as well as the facility, to ensure that both had a chance to explore and enjoy the characters and situations. Nevertheless, it was clear that Whedon was drawn a bit more towards the cabin, while Goddard a bit more towards the facility. Goddard asked Whedon about the diary that would be found and read, and Whedon disappeared for, according to Goddard, about 6 minutes, and then returned with the completed diary, saying that it just poured out of him, and defined the nature of these prairie folk who worshipped pain. Goddard, on the other hand, had grown up near Los Alamos, and saw in the facility the same kind of people that he saw in his youth. Brilliant yet ordinary people who would get up every day and go to work, making weapons that could destroy the world. They reached their goal and had a complete script, and after that they rewrote it to smooth it out, and ensure that nothing felt like it came out of nowhere. During the writing, Goddard felt that this was the film he wanted for when he first directed. And so when Whedon suggested that he would produce and Goddard would direct, Goddard leapt at it. He was crestfallen when Whedon later considered directing it himself, but in the end they stuck with the arrangement of producer and director. This worked out well for the pair, because not only did it mean that both of them would have a chance to learn those crafts on their own film. Whedon had been producer, but on television or on movies where he was doing other roles. This was the first time where he was doing it solely as a producer. It also meant that Whedon could be the one wearing the writer's hat on set so that Goddard could focus on being a director first rather than a writer first. Selling a studio on an unproven director for a film like this wouldn't be easy, but after the end of the 2007-2008 writer's strike, they approached Mary Parent at MGM. She agreed this script was ready for production and was willing to back up Goddard, and was tough enough to ensure that no one would be second-guessing that decision. So Goddard decided that they should do everything that they could with practical effects possible, and then leave CGI only for the other things that were impossible. That was a tremendous undertaking, because the film would involve dozens and dozens of different monsters, which would in the end require 10 craft shops worth of model makers and artists to try to create. And even then, many would still be realized as digital images, because even with all those monsters, there were never enough. Digital monsters would be inserted simply to fill out scenes that weren't full enough as bedlam unfolded on every screen in the control room, or the brief shots throughout of the unfortunate victims being slaughtered in their own facility. The plan had been to shoot the film in California, but when the numbers were crunched, it was decided there was no way they could ignore the millions of dollars in savings if they did it in Canada. It turned out to be the right move, given that the forest looked exactly the way they knew it should be, although they had one problem right away. Pre-production had begun in January with shooting planned for early March, but there's a large difference between early March in California and Canada. Sure enough, the night before the first day of shooting, snow began to fall, and the next day it looked like the perfect set for a Christmas film, but not for a vacationing teen who was going to be swimming outside. Hair dryers were used to melt enough snow to try to get some shots in, but from the beginning of the film they fell behind schedule, forcing Whedon to take on first and second unit directing duties just to try to keep them on schedule. This would prove particularly grueling for Whedon, who would finish up this film only to go immediately off to work on his show Dollhouse, which left him very exhausted, naturally. But with the number of monsters called for, this was needed. They weren't sure they'd be able to get them all due to the expense, especially the dragon bat. It was the one they expected that they were going to have to lose. Ironically, the monster they lost was the simplest one. It was called Kevin. It required no makeup. But in the midst of the bedlam, his role as a monster was so questionable that he just wouldn't fit in, so they had to abandon him. It wasn't the only time that the threats to the film came in human form. MGM was being chased by its creditors at this time. The studio was so in debt that the interest payments alone on that debt was $250 million annually. And with MGM making only $500 million a year, well, they were in real trouble. Desperate for a gimmick, they canceled the October 23, 2009 release of Cabin in the Woods so that they could explore the possibility of creating a 3D version of the film to cash in on all of the buzz around Cameron's up-and-coming film, Avatar. It was quickly concluded that just wasn't going to work, but by now, it was too late. With the arrival of the Great Recession, the market further shrunk, and MGM was forced to declare bankruptcy to try to survive. Cabin found itself trapped in limbo, unable to hit its scheduled January 14, 2011 release date now. What helped, at least in part, rescue the film was the presence of one of its principal actors. No, it wasn't Richard Jenkins, whose name was on everyone's lips after his role in The Visitor, and yet was still willing to play Sitterson in the control room. Nor was it the presence of a surprise cameo by Sigourney Weaver, who had aggrieved and was incredibly eager to get her picture taken with the werewolf. It was that of the actor who didn't even survive to the third act of the film, Chris Hemsworth. When Hemsworth was giving instructions to the other characters, there was a sense that he was a true action hero. And when MGM saw the dailies, he was immediately asked to do their remake of Red Dawn, the other film that wound up in MGM limbo. 2 days after that, he landed the role of Thor. With the huge success of him in that role as the Thunder God, the hype building towards the first Avenger film that was written by Whedon, and of course the big success of Goddard's Cloverfield, still fresh in everybody's minds at this point, well, the film was rescued from MGM by Lionsgate. Whedon and Goddard welcomed the change of ownership, since not only did it mean that their film would finally see the light of day, but Lionsgate had emerged as a horror movie powerhouse, including Saw, American Psycho, and The Descent. Everyone expected a Halloween release, but because of that horror background, Lionsgate wasn't locked into going for a holiday tie-in. It could stand on its own as a horror film as far as they were concerned, though they did wind up releasing it on the 13th of April to have just a little bit of spookiness related to its release. The film was highly anticipated and wound up doing well with audiences and with critics, scoring a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 92%, describing it as, quote, an astonishing meta feat capable of being funny, strange, and scary, frequently all at the same time. So much so that not only was Lionsgate asking for a sequel, although given the film's ending there was uncertainty as to how they would even go about that, but they all got sued. A writer named Peter Gallagher, not the guy from the OC, claimed he had already written and self-published a story called The Little White Trip that was about a group of 5 teens in a cabin being terrorized, only to discover that they are being recorded for the enjoyment of others. A few similarities exist, but as the judge in the case noted, nothing unexpected given the subject matter and the approach taken to it. The decision was that Whedon and Goddard's film is indeed an original piece of work, and judging from responses, audience seemed to feel the same way.